Hello, my name is Chris Dunn, and I am the Director of the Hydrologic Engineering Center, or otherwise known as HEC. I want to welcome you to a four-part series where I will provide background on policy and regulations for risk assessments, which is really an overview of Engineer Regulation ER 1105-2-101. Specifically, in this first presentation, we are going to briefly introduce you to the ER, which is called Risk Assessment for Flood Risk Management Studies, and its latest version, 15 July 2019. At HEC, we think it's important that you understand why you have to do a risk assessment, as well as learn how to do a risk assessment. So this series of videos will focus on the ER. ER 1105-2-101 is the policy that states what you must do, and EM 1110-2-1619 is the guidance that states how you do a risk assessment. So the objectives for this first video in the series is to provide you a quick introduction to the ER and explain the risk framework. In subsequent videos, we will define key risk assessment terms and sources of uncertainties. We'll define the NED plan, or the National Economic Development Plan. We'll give you an understanding of the economic and performance reporting requirements, and we'll talk about communication and other considerations, and we'll identify impediments to the risk assessment. So what's the purpose of the ER? Well, the purpose of the ER is to provide guidance on risk assessment requirements for flood risk management studies, including but not limited to this whole array of studies, including feasibility studies, post-authorization changes, general reevaluation studies, dam and levee safety studies, and major rehabilitation studies. So the ER pretty much covers the gamut of risk studies that you would perform. It is important to note that the ER was jointly developed by the engineering COP and the planning COP. So the planning COP is well aware of the guidance and its importance as well. It is also interesting to point out that the ER covers coastal projects as well. The Coastal Working Group decided that the ER did in fact cover coastal projects and was the major consideration for the latest revision of the ER. So a little bit of the background. So Dave Mosier, former chief economist of the Corps, used to say that risk analysis has been around a long time. And that's true. The first version of the ER was written 25 years ago in March of 1996. It was revised in January of 2006 and again in 2017. And the most recent version distributed in July of 2019. So risk requirements have been around for 25 years. They might be new to you, but they've been around for a long time. Another thing to note is the accompanying engineer manual, EM 1110-2-1619, is currently being updated to reflect the changes in ER 1105-2-101. We are very close to making that update come true, and I look forward to seeing it myself. So why did we update? So I'd have to say the first and foremost reason was Hurricane Katrina, which occurred in August 31st, 2005. The results of Hurricane Katrina changed how USACE looked at risk. And instead of going from something where we talked about risk to something that we're actually going to do a risk analysis. Also, many other changes regarding how USACE evaluates risk happened after Hurricane Katrina as well. So ER 1105-2-101 needed to reflect those changes. So if we go back one slide, we see that we have a revision in January of 2006. I must tell you that that particular version of the ER did not include the impacts from Hurricane Katrina. That version was in the mix, was being developed before Hurricane Katrina occurred, and it was actually at headquarters for review at that time. It wasn't really until after Katrina happened and we had time to digest the impacts of Katrina did we update the ER again, and those updates are found in the 17 July 2017 version of the ER. And as I said, the 2019 version was written mostly because to include coastal studies, and also to tighten the definition of annual exceedance probability. So other reasons for the update, principally because of Hurricane Katrina, USACE established a national flood risk management program to advance the goals of flood risk identification, communication, and response and management to save lives and reduce property damage. Essentially, it was set up to develop the risk framework. Thirdly, Dr. Mosier, chief economist of the Corps, and others co-wrote a document called Transforming the Corps into a Risk Managing Organization. Basically, the document talked about how USACE had to change to become an agency that really manages risk. We thought these recommendations needed to be captured in the updated version of the ER, which is the 2017 version. And as we said before, we needed clarity on the coastal studies as well, hence the 2019 version. So what's included in the latest version of the ER? First, there's terminology like resilience, which actually has two different definitions in this presentation. Formerly, resilience was not a term that you would use when you were formulating a project. Now it is. Risk assessments versus risk analysis. So risk analysis was a term used by many for a lot of different reasons. And so instead of calling the analysis part of a risk process, instead of calling it risk analysis, we now call them risk assessments. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some subsequent slides. And then also talk about transferred versus transformed risk, where transferred risk means you move risk from one area to another, where transformed risk means that a new risk forms as a result of mitigating a risk. We talk about system performance and system features. No longer do we look at just a local area and say that a project supports or protects that local area. We must look at the entire system. As we found out with Katrina, that while some levees were very well built, other levees were weaker, and those weaker levees is where the floods happened, and essentially it didn't really matter if you had a strong levee in one location, because a weak levee in another location could still cause system failure. So now we do look at systems rather than just local projects. There was some focus on life loss. There's focus on environmental impact considerations. We introduced the term smart planning. SMART meaning specific measures, measurable projects, attainable, risk-informed, and timely. We talk about climate change and the use of climate change in flood risk management type studies. There's updated references and enhanced definition sections as well. So what's included? Risk frameworks, another thing that's included. So in the risk framework, which is really a decision-making process that is comprised of a risk assessment, that's where the engineers, the economists, the geotechs are doing their analysis, their engineering analysis in that risk assessment piece. Okay. There's risk management, which is the policy preference-based, where actions are considered and discussed. And then there's risk communication. This is a collaborative and communicates information about preferences and uncertainty concerning risk. Those three pieces, risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, make up the risk framework. This was first introduced in the 2007 document, Transforming the Corps into a Risk Managing Organization, by Dr. Mosier and others. A nice figure in the ER where it helps you understand risk is this figure on flood risk conceptualized. And it starts out on the left with a hazard. What can cause the harm? Well, in flood risk case, that's the flood, that's the water. Next is performance. How will the system react? Is it a strong levee and can support the flood, or is it a weakened levee and it would actually perhaps fail prior to being overtopped, something like that? Performance. Exposure. Who and what is in harm's way? Vulnerability. How susceptible is it to harm? Has it been flood proofed? Is there other things that you've done? If it's a farmer's field in agriculture, are the crops fully grown or are the crops just been planted? And then consequences. How much harm actually would occur? And consequences are really a function of all of the items in this particular figure. So history. All measured or estimated values are to various degrees uncertain. So risk and uncertainty are intrinsic in the water resources planning and design. So USACE traditionally developed best estimates These estimates were considered the most likely values. This is the most likely scenario that's going to happen. And these things are frequently based on imperfect analysis methods, short periods of record, small sample sizes, and measurements that were subject to error. So let's unpack that a little bit. So first, imperfect analysis methods. We would like to think that the HEC products, the HEC pieces of software, are good analysis methods, but still they are mathematical approximations from the natural process. So they are in fact imperfect analysis methods. Secondly, short periods of record. What would you consider a long period of record? 20, 30 years maybe? You're lucky if you have 20 or 30 years, let alone 100 years. But even if you had 100 years of record, that's but a blip in what has happened over geological time. So what you're seeing there is still more or less a snapshot of what has happened over a geological period of time. Small sample sizes. For any number of reasons, time and money being two of them, we seldom can or want to sample everything. For example, if you were looking at a large study in a large metropolitan area, you would not be able to sample all the houses for both their value as well as their content value, things like that. And then fourth, measurements are subject to error. Even our best survey data comes with some error. So our best estimates frequently are based on a number of things that would cause us a certain amount of uncertainty. We would do in history, we would do sensitivity analysis and been our primary tool for considering uncertainty, and frequently presumes that the appropriate range of values is identified and that all these values in that range are equally likely. Well, we know that's not necessarily true. So results typically reported as a single most likely value that are treated by some as if they were perfectly accurate. And again, we know that's not true. So why a risk assessment? Well, basically it captures what you know, but it also captures what you don't know. A risk assessment captures and quantifies the extent of the risk and uncertainty in the various planning and design concepts. The total effect of uncertainty on the project's design and economic viability can be examined, and conscious decisions can be made reflecting an explicit trade-off between the risks that we know and the costs. So risk assessment can be used to compare plans in terms of variability of their physical performance, economic success, and residual risk. Its explicit consideration of risk and uncertainty can help to address budget constraints, increase customer cost sharing, and public concern for project performance issues, and improve investment decisions. So with this slide, we have completed the first of 4 presentations in this series. In this presentation, we provided a shorter review of ER 1105-2-101. Now would be a great time to capture any questions you have on this session, and we can discuss them later in one of our discussion sessions. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.